Hi everyone, today I want to talk about balance in Diablo 4, or the lack of it, and what could be done to improve it. So if you look at our endgame tier list here, for example on Maxroll, you will see that there is quite an interesting common denominator for most of the top tier builds out there. And it might not seem that obvious at the start, but once you actually dive in and look at the setups and you know the meta, then you will really quickly understand that something is quite off here. And what I'm talking about is overpower damage. Especially with the recent season launch, a lot of builds have transitioned to becoming overpower builds. And I think this is a massive problem for the game, not just from the balancing perspective, but also from the fun perspective. So let's take a look at some of the top builds that we have here listed on Maxroll right now and what their best versions, their highest power versions actually run. Well, we have Lightning Spear, Overpower, 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 doesn't work, doesn't work, Overpower, Overpower, doesn't work, Overpower, and so on. Yeah, so I guess you kind of get the idea here. And the only exception that we have in the top like 12 builds or something are basically all the Earthquake builds that are just kind of overtuned with their own little scaling problems, like the heavy hitter tempers, for example. But in general, you can see that a lot of the top builds, even all the way down into A and B tier, are just based on overpower these days. Everything that can overpower will overpower is effectively how things are going right now. And this goes so far that even a lot of the sword builds at the top end actually run overpower stuff. So we had this here, even this here. So as a class that has zero overpower synergies, that is not even like really intended to run with overpowers, actually goes for it. Thanks to the Xan rune. A lot of builds run Xan to get more overpowers, and this is a way to scale your damage. Now here's a problem with that. The Xan rune is just not really fun to play around most of the time. In most builds that run this rune, you usually have very low uptime of this effect. It triggers maybe every 3 seconds, maybe every 2 seconds, every 4 seconds, or somewhere in that range for most of these setups. Some of them can make it a bit more consistent, or they have some other overpower triggers that makes it feel like it's somewhat regularly active, basically, because you also get overpowers, for example, from, playing a bear druid, like a boulder has a bunch of random overpowers happening in addition to the Xan rune. Or, you have a perma overpower build on something like Hurricane and Cataclysm, because you just snaps out the buff and it will last the entire duration of that skill. But most of these other builds actually have very infrequent overpowers that deal a lot of damage, but then you do nothing the rest of the time. One great example of this and why it feels so bad is the Double Swing Barb. Double Swing Barb right now is based on overpower as well. Surprise, surprise, thanks to Crown of Lucion and spending a lot of resources and Banished Lord's Talisman. So this is also another way to get overpowers. And in this case, Double Swing works in a way that you do 2 swings that do 0 damage, and then you do 1 swing that procs the overpower that does all of the damage. And like this, you basically run around from every single small trash monster, from zombie to zombie, and swing 2 times, and then the third one will kill it. But then I walk up to the elite, and I swing 2 times, and the third one will also kill it. So this is basically how that goes. And I think this is just completely terrible design and terrible gameplay. And a lot of the other builds also have a very similar problem. Another great example is Pulverize, where you have a bunch of random overpower procs that either happen or they don't, and then you walk up to a pack and you never really know when you will kill the pack. You just start pulverizing into the pack and then you do no damage, nothing, and then boom, it explodes. And then you walk to the next pack, the next overpower is immediately ready, so you do 1 tap, boom, that pack explodes as well. And you go to the next one and you just hit for nothing 5 times in a row again. So like this, there's this weird like inconsistent feeling that comes with the overpowers because they are, somewhat rare, somewhat unpredictable in some cases, or at the very least just have very low uptime when you, for example, try to use Banished Lords or the Xan rune. So not only are most of the top builds based on overpower, and the balancing issues that we have in the game could be relatively easily solved with a nerf, because then all of the S stuff would come down depending on how much we nerf it, but also the gameplay itself is actually really awful on most of these builds. But why exactly is this actually happening? What happened with Overpower that made it so good suddenly? I mean, we had overpower builds in the past, back in season 0 already. There were barb builds, like I made the Kratos barb, for example, and you know, you went into the boss room, you stack up your buffs, and then you do like the big bonk on the boss and one-shot it with the death blow. That felt really fun and like a satisfying combo to use. But the thing is, if I did a mistake, it wasn't like day and night. It was not like, okay, there's the difference between one-shotting the boss and then doing 1%. It was like, okay, maybe I don't one-shot it if I do a mistake and I don't get the overpower, but I still did like 50% on the boss, for example. But these days, it's literally the difference between doing 100% of the damage or doing 1% of the damage. This is how large this gap has gotten. Part of the reason is just power creep, because a lot of the multipliers that we have in the game have just gotten larger. So there are a lot of examples of aspects being higher values now, glyphs, higher values. There's like paragon nodes that interact with overpowers on various classes and so on. So you can specialize into overpowers, and this means that the more you specialize into this overpower synergy, the more the overpowers will grow compared to the rest of your damage. So obviously when you do an overpower, it's really big, and if you don't, then it's nothing. And the more the devs allow us to synergize with overpowers, the more this gap will grow. But that's not the only problem that overpower has. There's another thing that has happened that we also warned the devs about in advance, actually, which is the overpower scaling formula that we have. And on the fateful night of October 8th, 2024, you might remember that date, well, something terrible happened that should have been addressed a long time ago, but never was. What a lot of people don't understand about overpower is how it actually scales with your life and your fortified life. And this is actually something that we have explained here, for example, in our Damage for Beginners articles. So if you look at overpower damage here, then you will learn that the damage formula for overpower is based on the base life of your character. So the TLDR of this is that for every 100% of your base life, you'll also get 100% increased damage value. So what this means is that when you have double the life of a naked character with no paragons and so on, then you will have 100% extra damage. When you have times 10 the life, then you will have 900% extra damage. And now you can also fortify all that life, and this effectively doubles the value. So a character that has 10 times the life of a naked character has 20 times the damage when they overpower. And what happened with the Vessel of Hatred launch was that Blizzard tried to do the stat squish and actually squished the base life of characters by a factor of 20. So before the expansion, we had base life of 8,000 on our characters, give or take, it was a bit rounded. And now we have 400. So it's literally 5% of the previous value. But the actual character, like high-end gear characters that we have, are actually really close in life values compared to what we had pre-expansion. If you look at this, for example, right now, my Necromancer standing in town here, I have 21k life with some potions. I can go to like 30k or something like that pretty easily. And this is not even on the high end. Like we have builds that have 40, 50, 60,000 life, even more if you really want. And with a base life of 400, you can scale overpower to the moon this way. If you compare this to pre-expansion levels of life, then the factor of the actual life in endgame versus the base life is roughly 10 times larger now. We did have more life before the expansion as a baseline, which was around 8,000, and our characters went to something like 50 to 100,000 or something. But even these days, with a base life of 400, we still get to dozens of thousands. So there is like this roughly 10, so give or take, depending on the build and the exact setup and the gear that you're running, there will be a bit of a plus and minus. But the TLDR is that overpower scaling is just 10 times stronger than it was. And that just happened overnight thanks to the stat squish. So what actually happens with builds that we run these days is that increased damage values are just completely irrelevant on every overpower build. Typical builds in the endgame with like a fully decked out setup and full glyphs and so on, they usually end up somewhere in the range of like 2,000 to 3,000 increased damage or something like that. So if you count together all of the increases from your glyphs and these paragon nodes here, like damage to elites, increased damage, damage to close enemies, shadow damage, all this is called additive damage or increased damage. This is all the same big multiplier that all just kind of gets added together as one value. So with most builds reaching somewhere in like the 2 to 3k range, most overpower builds reach somewhere in the range of 20 to 30,000 increased damage, which not only completely devalues everything you could ever put on your paragons and your glyphs and even your items, like these 140% vulnerable damage and modifiers or something like that, they literally don't matter for overpower builds because the overpower scaling is just so large. So not only does the overpower formula create extremely powerful setups, but it also cascades down into itemization and gear progression, character progression, and it just kind of devalues a lot of the other things you can possibly do with your character. And the only thing you kind of care about is stacking some of the multipliers like main stat, and then of course more life, so you get more overpower damage. And not just that, because you're so incentivized to stack life to get more damage, you also get extremely tanky as well. So a lot of these overpower builds that we look at the tier list, for example, they're just so tanky that you can just fit in even more greedy setups and offensive choices in your defensive slots, and you leave out defensive glyphs, you leave out defensive passives, and you just don't care because at some point you just become immortal anyway. And the thing is that even if you try to make a build that doesn't usually have any overpower synergies or try to build into overpowers in any special way, it's just kind of like pop in a Xan rune and see what happens kind of deal. So for example, I tried some Tornado Druid like that lately, where I didn't pick any of the Druid overpower synergies like the glyph or anything. I just popped in the Xan rune, and whenever I triggered that every 4 seconds, I would just insta one-shot everything, but the other like 3.7 seconds in between when it's not active, I would just do no damage at all. And this is exactly all coming back to this overpower and life formula that I just described. But the problem is that there's just not really any alternative for that. You can't not build into overpowers when you have access to overpowers, either thanks to the Xan rune, thanks to the Banished Lords, thanks to whatever it might be. Overpowers just are too strong, and they also lead to incredibly terrible gameplay, as I had described. Take this example of the Werewolf Druid as well, where every 4 seconds I would get a burst of damage that just destroys everything, but in between I can't even kill the smallest trash monster, for example. And I think at this point we can safely say that science has gone too far here, and something really needs to be addressed very soon, because I don't really want to see yet another season where we have exactly this kind of overpower meta. We had it in season 6 and in season 7 and in season 8. Every season I try to keep reminding the devs of please do something, and I think it's really time, because we just see how dominant it is, but also how it really sucks out the fun from a lot of these setups. I want to play a Tornado Druid where I can throw tornadoes and they actually kill stuff. And you can slowly see the monsters melt away, and not just nothing, 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 and then boom, they explode. That's not how I want to play Tornado. And that's not how I want to play Double Swing. I want to go with a Double Swing. I want to play like in Season 2, where I just walk from pack to pack and I swing and stuff pops. That's what I want. I don't want to sit there, do nothing, and then pop the entire pack, because it's just awful. It's just not great gameplay. And the same applies to a lot of the other even baseline overpower builds. If you play a Boulder Druid, I had a ton of fun with the setup, and it is kind of consistent enough, but even there, where you have these 10 boulders, there will be like 2 or 3 of them that overpower, and the other 7 just do nothing. They just rotate around you, and you never know when the next rotating boulder will hit the target and actually kill it. And that's just awful. I think overpowers need to be somewhere in the range where, they are noticeable, they are impactful when they happen, but they're not the absolute requirement to actually deal any kind of damage. But this is exactly what is happening right now. If you play this build here, your overpower boulders will kill everything, and the normal boulders will kill nothing. And the same applies to all of the other builds that build into overpower in any way. Without exaggerating, I would say most overpower builds have somewhere in the range of times 50 multiplier on their overpowers, just thanks to all of the life scaling, the baseline scaling, and then potentially some extra stuff from the class specific glyphs and passives and whatnot, if those are available. And you just have way too much of a gap here. So if overpower damage was brought down, or rather the overpower formula for life scaling was adjusted to be more reasonable and in line with what we saw before the expansion, then a lot of our balancing concerns and a lot of the gameplay problems that we have with those builds would immediately be resolved. If an overpower does triple the damage of a normal hit, then that would be okay, I think. I could deal with that. But I can't really deal with it when it does 30 times the damage. There's just not really a great gameplay feeling. And again, we have these other issues where you have these weird setups where just nothing matters on your stats, on your items, on your glyphs and so on. And Paragon boards actually look extremely weird in some cases. If you really want to min-max an overpower build, then at some point you will effectively just click like int nodes, for example. You don't even click like, these like damage nodes that are right here or something like that. You don't even max out your glyphs because you don't care. You have 30,000% increased damage anyway. So why would you ever, click on like a plus 15% here, for example? So instead, you just take this and you just, do some weird pathing, click a random int node, and that is actually more damage than you could ever get from any of your glyphs, for example. So this is also just extremely unintuitive behavior. And I think that's something should really be done here about the overpower formula. If this was brought back in line with what we used to know, or for example, if just the overpower scaling per life and 45 was reduced by roughly a factor of 10, then I think we would actually see a much more overall balanced meta with a lot of builds landing with what is currently the A tier range, for example, on our tier list. And you would see a much better like overall balancing and also difficulty progression, I think, in the game right now. Of course, there are still plenty of builds that are pretty strong up there that don't rely on overpower. There's, for example, minion necros, and there's, maybe some dot builds up here like blight necro. A bunch of stuff is there that doesn't actually rely on overpower, mostly for the reason that it can't, because a dot cannot overpower, for example. For the most part, there's a lot of stuff here that will just be suddenly a lot more reasonable. And all of this is also mostly the reason why we have a lot of other imbalances in the game. Sorc has traditionally been perceived pretty weak since the expansion. Well, that is because overpowers exist on other classes and Sorcs couldn't really build so much into them like other classes can. And so they just fell behind. Or Sorcs also have a lot of dot builds. They have Incinerate, they have Firewall, and so on. So there's a bunch of stuff that cannot profit from overpower that is just like generally behind. And the same goes with some of the other builds on, for example, Spiritborn, with some of the poison builds like Stinger. It just can't do that, so it just falls behind in comparison. And even stuff like Andario Rogue, this is probably like a fan favorite from Season 5. A lot of people played that, and every season people come back to ask me about it. And it's just kind of dead in the water because, we got so many extra synergies on top of, all the other expansion changes, but also overpower. That just is way too large of a modifier for a lot of builds. And if you don't have access to it, then it doesn't work. In any case, I hope that I could explain this the best way possible without really, diving too hard in like Excel sheets and looking at every single DPS number and life number and everything like that. I think the general picture is pretty clear. My main problem is the gameplay is awful because overpowers are inconsistent, and when they happen, they do everything, and when they don't happen, you can't kill even the smallest monster. So that gap is way too large. And of course, just the overall balance of the game. Almost every single top tier build is based on overpower damage. So just by adjusting overpower as a whole, you could already just balance out the game overall, basically, with all the classes, all the top builds kind of like dropping down a little bit. And then we have, a lot more builds to choose from, a lot better class and build variety. And we can still go from there and do any kind of buffs that are needed. If you look at our tier list here right now, you would think, yeah, this actually looks pretty fine. Every class is pretty much represented here somewhere near the top, with like maybe this exception, but even that is like an overpower setup, for example. If you superficially look at our tier list, you will say, yeah, this actually looks like a fairly balanced meta, everything is fine. We have every class represented, maybe with like an exception down here or something like that. But well, if you look a little bit deeper, there are just so many problems like are caused by overpower. So I really hope that the devs will take this to heart, and maybe we're gonna see some adjustments as soon as Season 9 already, because I think it's really plaguing the game right now. So that's it for what I have to share here about this topic. Let me know what you think, if you have any other points to make or some other feedback to give about it. So of course, this would mean a relatively large shift in the meta all at once, and the devs would have a lot of work to do to fix a bunch of the stuff that kind of like falls through and it's kind of like too weak. I don't want to like take everything and then like bring it down to like C tier or something like that. But the thing is that if, let's say, you literally remove like a ×10 multiplier from all of these builds up here, well, they would still be all more than fine. It would mostly be a matter of actually trying to fix some stuff that is more down here, that is actually currently overpower based, that would then really kind of drop far lower, like I guess this means Hoda Barb, Deathblow, you know, Crushing Hand. Like these are also like all like Overpower builds, for example. You know, a bunch more stuff here on Barbs and Druids, like Polarize. Certainly we would see some like victims of such a change as well. That would definitely need to be addressed, but I think overall it would lead to a much healthier game if there was a much more reasonable overpower mechanic in the game. So that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed my thoughts, and let's see what happens. See you guys next time.